Oh no, this is not what I meant. The confinement I am referring to is the restriction of electrons' movement in a very small space, like the atom. Without confinement, electrons are free to move in three-dimensional space. We can liken electrons to cars that can go up or down, left to right in order to avoid other cars. But if they are confined in a 2D space, movement of one car affects all other cars. In physics, confinement is achieved when space is about the size of an atom, like an atom-thick graphene. This article I reviewed entitled Robust Ultra-Low Friction State of Graphene via Murray Superlattice Confinement involves fine-tuning the mechanical or physical properties of 2D graphene to maintain low level of friction. This was taken from the journal Nature Communications at nature.com. I chose this article because it addresses classical problem existing in a quantum world. Friction has always been known to exist in surfaces due to irregularities of surfaces and atomic interactions. Normally, friction is useful. One cannot imagine walking without it. But sometimes, friction is also a problem. In the classical world of mechanics, it becomes a problem with moving engine parts such as pistons and tires since they cause wear, tear, and even fire. In the minute world of quantum mechanics, the amount and problem with friction becomes significant due to large surfaces of materials compared to their volume. In the classical world, friction is minimized by bearing and lubrications, but in the quantum world, these solutions are too large and would destroy very small materials. However, when 2D materials such as graphene are stuck together, they exhibit a new phenomenon called superfluidity, where fluids flow without friction. Since the successful discovery and isolation of graphene in 2004, the field of two-dimensional materials and research on the discovery, characterization, and application of novel 2D materials has grown exponentially. In 2D materials, each layer is composed of a covalently bonded lattice and is weakly coupled to its neighboring layers by van der Waal interaction. The quantum confinement effect and reduced screening effect, arising from thickness reduction in 2D materials, often manifest themselves in features clearly different from those of their bulk counterparts. Due to their unique physical characteristics, they provide rich and ideal research platforms for studying quantum confinement effects. How do they prepare graphene? You would think this is a really complicated and advanced technique, but brace yourself. They would simply put a sticky tape to a graphite, then remove it. They would repeat the process many times until they get a single layer of graphite, which is now called graphene. Yep, this is a nanotech that was taken low tech. The problem with 2D materials is that they chemically react with gases such as fluorine, oxygen, and hydrogen. Due to this, they would lose their superfluidity. This research I reviewed proposes solution to this problem. Their solution was an interfacial confinement of graphene and germanium. Confinement is not easy to do since it involves thinning of materials in such a way that the dimensions restrict electrons into smaller nano-sized dimensions. This is a pure graphene. As it is, it exhibits superfluidity when another graphene is stuck into it at some angle. However, as I have already mentioned, this is susceptible to chemical reaction. Thus, the study experimented by growing on a p-type germanium 111 films of monolayer polycrystalline graphene with a weak domain orientation through chemical vapor deposition. The product is graphene germanium 111, or in this study they coupled it as grown graphene. Chemical vapor deposition, or CVD, has been used in manufacturing. It begins with the tank in red containing hydrogen gas, methane, and argon as initiators. Initiators help speed up the process. The purple and blue tubes contain monomers of graphene. In this study, the graphene was synthesized at 916 degrees Celsius for 5 hours, then introduced into the vacuum chamber containing P-type germanium 111. In the vacuum chamber, hot graphene in gaseous form naturally forms a coating on the colder substrate, like water vapor coating a glass of cold water. A 32 by 32 by 30 angstrom slab supercell containing 3 layers of germanium atoms and monolayer graphene with a vacuum gap of more than 19 angstrom was used. The rotation angles between graphene and germanium substrate were selected as 2.2 and 30 degrees. In order to measure the effect of chemical reaction, some prepared or as-grown graphene was fluorinated. It was performed by exposing the sample into the SF6 plasma for 3 minutes in the Oxford Plasma Lab System 100. Suppress the effect of ion bombardment to graphene, the sample was placed face down using a quartz holder. The SF6 flow rate was set as 40 sccm and the plasma power was 50 watts with a bias voltage of 23 volts. During fluorination, the chamber pressure and temperature of the sample stage was 96 millitors and 60 degrees Celsius respectively. The product is called fluorinated graphene. So now we have two types of graphene samples for the experiment: as-grown graphene, or GR/GE111, and the fluorinated graphene, or FGR/GE111. For measurements and instruments, this research used the Bruker multimode 8 system to perform the friction height pull-off force measurements. Two of the instruments involved were scanning tunneling microscope and the atomic force microscope. STM images were acquired with the platinum iridium alloy tip in normal ambient under the constant current mode. We already know that this technique of imaging surpasses that of light microscope. On the other hand, to measure very weak forces, they used an atomic force microscope. This works by tapping a really sensitive pointed tip which deflects even with a very weak force. This deflection is recorded in a graph through lasers. During lateral force microscopy measurements, silicon probes with nominal tip radius of curvature 2 nanometers were chosen. Deflection sensitivity of the probe is 33.66 nanometer per volts, and the spring constant at the room temperature is 0.35 newtons per meter. Lateral force microscopy images were obtained simultaneously with the topographic images. In terms of calculation, this study used first principles calculation. The DFT calculations with a non-local exchange correlation function were performed using the Vienna ab initio simulation package. The projector augmented wave method was utilized to model the core electrons. The friction force was calculated by subtracting the forward and backward friction signals on its scan line and divided by 2. This figure shows the schematic diagram of experimental setup in this study. Whew! The principle was easy, but processes and materials are easier, right? And the result is, these are topography and frictional force images obtained with an atomic force microscope. At B and E are the height measurements in nanometers, while C and D are friction force measurements in nanonewtons of as-grown and fluorinated graphene. Force is proportional with color. The darker color corresponds to lower force. At C, we can see that very small friction is measured in as-grown graphene, consistent with previous results, and the color is black. At the fluorinated graphene in D, we can see that it has become yellowish, which means that the friction increased. However, there coexist some randomly distributed islands where friction is still low, the same as that of an as-grown graphene. It must be noted that things here are already very, very small in the order of nanometers. But because this is science, we want to go fundamental. So we dive even smaller to explore the origin of friction contrast on the fluorinated graphene heterostructure. Detailed friction measurements across the base and the island regions were measured, as shown in the lateral force image in this figure and the line traces here. No regular atomic steep slip can be observed in the high friction base region, suggesting a disordered nature of the surface. However, in the island regions where the ultra-low friction behavior is preserved, atomic stick slip can be clearly observed with a superposed long-range variation forming a six-fold symmetric superlattice structure. In this investigation, one thing was made clear: that the friction contrast between these two different surfaces is associated with the presence or absence of superlattice structure. This is the STM image from the island region. It indicates that the superlattice structure in the lateral force coincides with the moire pattern formed between graphene and germanium. Because increasing relative rotation angle leads to rapid decrease of its periodical length, moire patterns are only visible in STM images for regions where graphene and germanium lattices are nearly aligned at 2.2 degrees, while it was misaligned at 30 degrees. Why was friction less in the islands or moire superlattice structures of fluorinated graphene? Is it because this area was less fluorinated than the base? 3D topography by STM shows that both regions were fluorinated equally. Essentially, different degree of fluorination as a primary mechanism for the observed friction contrast in the two regions has been excluded. In conclusion, confined germanium and graphene, aligned at 2.2 degrees, maintains its superfluidity even when fluorinated or oxygenated due to the presence of moire superlattice structures. I am really amazed by this study of a group of Chinese scientists. They showed remarkable scientific attitude in tediously measuring very, very small dimensions, million times smaller than a human hair. The techniques used in measuring very, very weak forces are also stunning. I never thought such a force can be measured. With this, I hope that we have learned something today and we were inspired by this work. Thank you.